That's the enjoyable bit. Okay.
Here we go. Great. Let's just getting everyone in. Should be coming in. First couple of minutes is always allowing people in.
Yep, that's
just a couple of minutes, and the majority probably will just turn up something like in about 10 minutes, and then we always get a rush towards the end as well. We get another 100 people somehow 1 hour late. But hey, it's life. Right, okay, folks, welcome. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome from all around the world to another Islamic Courses session. Honored and privileged. Today's session is a very interesting one, something very close to my heart. As a former economist at Reuters, I can tell you a lot about economics. But anyway, I'm really honored to hear from our two guests, Professor Jared Rubin and Professor Mehmet Asutay. But the title of discussion today is Book Review Discussion, Rulers, Religion and Riches, Why the West Got Rich and the Middle East Did Not. As I said, very honored and privileged to have Professor Jared Rubin, who is the co-director of the Institute for Study of Religion, Economics and Society at Chapman University, all the way in California, US of A. And it's hosted by friend Professor Mehmet Asutay, who's the director of Durham Center for Islamic Economics and Finance in the Business School at Durham University. Okay, so if everyone, if you don't mind, if you could keep the devices on silent, whatever you're using, PC, Macs or phones, it is being recorded. If you're not registered, just leave your email on the chat. There is a Q&A session. It's an extended Q&A session as well. The first half an hour, 40 minutes will be an interview by the host, Professor Mehmet, to Professor Jared. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Mehmet. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's good to be here. Hi to everyone and assalamu alaikum to everyone joining from the Muslim world and beyond. It is good to be here, and thank you very much for the Islamic Circles for organizing this event. We have been discussing with our host, Mizan al-Mulka, of representing the Islamic Circles, issues relating to economic development, religious matters. And I'm very much pleased to share this platform with Professor Jared Rubin. He has touched upon a number of issues which commonly is part of my intellectual curiosity as well. In my research as well as teaching, I'm engaged with the topics around Islam, Islamic political economy, the whole debate of Islam and economic development and the so-called underdevelopment in the Muslim world. And therefore, I have been following Professor Rubin's writings on the subject matter. And those of you from Durham and present in this session, they would remember having such material in our reading course as well. But of course, the discussion and the subject matter is very much still alive, and it's subject to debate in different corner of the Muslim world. In particular, with the emergence of Islamic economics and finance, the whole idea of managing development, because when we look at the 1960s and 70s discourse, in the emergence of Islamic economics and finance in modern times, perhaps that was very much affected by the same debate how development can be achieved in the Muslim world with Muslim identity and moving capital in the same ways, which is concerned with this particular good that Professor Rubin is going to discuss today with us. And hence Islamic finance was a response to the capital movement, because the idea was that capital is necessary for economic development. But that's the issue, and I'm a bit skeptical on the subject matter, but that's the issue that we will be discussing. And this particular book, we are going to discuss on rulers, religion, and riches, why the West got rich and the Middle East could not or did not. And Professor Rubin, as mentioned by Mizan, is a professor at Chapman University, but importantly, which I love his research, is looking at the dynamics between religion and religion institutions and the political and economic development relationship. And that is, of course, remain to be an important subject matter, in particular in the Muslim world, where religion still considered to be or perceived to be an important factor in arranging society and society relationship, and hence the impact on economics and politics. But without going any further, it's a real great pleasure to have you here, Professor Rubin, and I'm happy to meet you online. Hopefully, in the other times, in the normal, so-called normal times, we could be able to meet physically as well. And thank you very much, because and now you're in California. Of course, it's very early morning and it's Saturday. So thank you very much for allocating your family time early morning for this debate. It's good to have you, and hopefully we'll go with that. And I welcome you formally. Thank you very much for being here as well. Okay, let's go perhaps an introduction to book, Professor Rubin. I thought might serve to the interest of those colleagues who haven't had the opportunity to read your book. Although you have done amazing good work in summarizing the entire argument in the introductory chapter, but if you could just brief us on your main argument in the book, so that we can start the discussion from there. Thank you again. It's good to have you.
Sure, and it's great to be here, and thank you, Mehmet, for moderating this, and being so insightful with all of this. And thank you to Mizan for inviting me. This is it's a great opportunity, and it's wonderful to see all these people here. So the book starts with the question that has intrigued me for a couple decades now, since I started my work. Why didn't modernization occur in the Middle East first? Why did it occur in Europe? This is not a question that, if you go back, say, 1,000 years, would have been obvious. In fact, you would have suspected that modernization would have occurred first, or what we think of as modernization now, the modern economy based on international finance, international trade, capital accumulation, things like that. Europe was kind of a backwater for a very long time, especially relative to the Middle East. And the question is, we know that it occurred first, the growth of the modern economy in Europe, and not just in Europe, in Northwestern Europe, England, and to some extent the Netherlands. So why? And then the question, one question that kind of follows straight from that is, what role did religion play, if any? Obviously, there's two dominant religions in the region. Islam and Christianity, even though Christianity has its various flavors, particularly along the Protestant Catholic break. And the thing that had always bothered me is the state of the literature, to the extent that there was much, as of a couple decades ago or so, was there's one person really working on this specific question on a kind of a broad historical scale, named Timur Kuran, who's very, very, very good and has a lot of very interesting things to say. But a lot of the other stuff that you would know, especially from popular writings, looked at some aspect of the religion, whether it be some aspect of Christianity. There's a very famous hypothesis by Max Weber that says there's something about Protestantism, there's a Protestant ethic, or something about Islam that might have been conservative or something like this. The types of attributes that maybe don't lead to economic development, and that it always struck me as wrong. It's something that I have. For most of my life, actually, before becoming an economist, I was always interested in religion, and I read a lot about both Christianity and Islam in particular, Western religions, and the types of attributes that were attributed to actually both Islam and Christianity didn't strike me as going to be nearly salient enough to explain massive economic divergence. So the question becomes, well, if not that, then what? And is it possible that religion has played a role, but maybe not through doctrine itself? And this has taken me to where most of my research lies, and kind of put together in this book, which looks at the role that religion plays in politics. Because there, we might think that to the extent that political authorities actually have some power to impose laws and policies, or restrictions that might actually play a role in economic development or economic stagnation. And what the book tries to do is, first tries to think about how how rulers rule in any type of polity. So, I'm an economist. I try to think of things more generally, and try to think of ways of, at a very, very high level, at a broad level, think about the type of political economy outcomes that might occur from different ways of ruling. And what I mean by that is, some rulers rule mainly by coercion. They have access to guns or weapons. They can rule by force. Or the fear of force. Actually, in most cases, other rulers can rule by what I call legitimacy. And legitimacy we might think of as just people believe that this is the rightful ruler. And this can differ by society, what makes one legitimate. So in a democracy, it might be winning a fair and free election. In a monarchy, it might be being the eldest son of the previous king. And in some societies, religious legitimacy is really important. So having religious authorities, maybe speak your name positively in the Friday sermon, or maybe even be part of the state. And these things aren't mutually exclusive. You can rule by force and by religious legitimacy, or by democratic legitimacy, or by legitimacy from the economic elite, which is something that I point to as being pretty important in the book. And so what the book does is, it thinks through these things, and then it says, all right, well, what were the differences in Middle Eastern history and broadly construed Western European history? Now, to be clear, these are things that very obviously have a lot of context. They differ over time and place. What was happening in Egypt under the Mamluk empires is different in many respects than was happening in large swaths of the Middle East, say, under the Ottoman Empire. But what the book looks for are kind of similarities throughout the regions that also might have evolved over time. So this is very much, as Mehmet was pointing out, a dynamic argument, meaning that we're looking for things that are either changing or not changing over time in a broad sense. Again, realizing that history is very complex, and there are always going to be differences across time and space that can't be captured in a very kind of broad general framework. What the book points to then is, this kind of relatively older argument that the context under which Islam was formed is very different than the context under which Christianity was formed. Islam formed kind of at the same time as an expanding empire. And because of this, the original doctrine of Islam was very conducive to legitimating rule. And in this is also built into the early institutions of Islam as well. The kind of very early qadis were part of the state, and they continue to be part of the state. For millennia, or over a millennium. And this was something where the laws, as they evolved, especially in the first few centuries of Islam, were done very much in this context of not just being religious in nature, but also having to legitimate a very rapidly expanding state, which in many cases was expanding into places, well, for obvious reasons, where there weren't Muslims, because Islam was just recently formed. Whereas in Christianity, it forms for 3 centuries in the Roman Empire, where it is a minority religion. Even by the time it eventually is adopted by Constantine in the early 4th century, only at most 10% of the Roman Empire is Christian, and for its first few centuries, the Christians were persecuted. So what we see is then early Christian doctrine really has nothing about legitimating the state. And there's a famous statement by Jesus, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God. So this idea that there is this real separation between the heavenly kingdom and the earthly kingdom. And so what the book argues is, thinking about rule kind of from an economic standpoint, you think about costs and benefits to rule. When do you use religious legitimacy versus other types of legitimacy? Well, from the ruler's perspective, there's costs and benefits to doing so. The cost of religious legitimacy tends to be relatively inexpensive. And this is true in Christianity and in Islam. And all I mean by that is that if you're a ruler, you don't need to cede much to religious authorities to get them on your side, to get them to whatever it might be. So in some cases, it might even collect taxes. It could be to give you rulings in your favor. And what I mean by inexpensive is oftentimes, you have to maybe suppress rival religions. So this would have been a big thing in Europe for, large parts of the medieval period was anytime some type of heresy came up, rulers were supposed to suppress them. You might give tax exemptions, which certainly happened in both the Islamic world and in Christianity and the Christian world. But the things that religious authorities don't want are what I call, the big prizes. And the big prizes are stuff like property rights, stuff like massive investment in infrastructure and big public goods that are the types of things, and especially property rights. There's a large economics literature on this, that are the things that begin to make the modern economy grow. That you don't get the types of things that you start to see in Europe and then spreading to many parts of the rest of the world, and obviously even many parts of the Middle East in the 20th and 21st century, without these basic building blocks of what we might call limited rule, meaning rulers have limits on their power, which in turn often yields property rights, the rights to do with your property what you want, which encourages capital investment, investment of all kinds, really, which encourages trade, and all of the things that we think of as being important in the modern world. But it also, we also think of the other stuff too. Is, well, what are the incentives to invest in major kind of, say, infrastructure projects or communication networks, things like this, that were really important, as we originally saw in Europe in the say 18th and 19th centuries. Where do you get this? And so the book kind of goes back in history then and says, all right, well, if we think about, let's just say on the margin that the benefits of religious legitimacy are greater for a Muslim ruler than they are for a Christian ruler. How does that determine how a ruler might choose between various forms of staying in power? And excuse me, what the book argues is that, to use the terminology of economics, is that you can very quickly get into this equilibrium where rulers, when religious legitimacy is very, very effective, rulers choose, give a lot of power to religious authorities, which in turn means that the laws and policies that are the outcome of this, what we might think of as political bargain, reflect the interest of religious authorities. Now, religious authorities don't necessarily have interests that are anti-economic development. Oftentimes, more often than not, their interests are just kind of, you might think of them as orthogonal or independent of, they don't want things that necessarily really help economic development or harm economic development. Their interests are something completely different. But what this also means is that those people, like merchants, like potentially financiers, traders, the early bankers, if you want to call them that, don't really have a say in political outcomes. This is not to say that that you want those types of people running your politics on the one hand, but on the other hand, if they don't have any say in politics, it's unlikely that the types of things they want are going to be part of the political outcome. And one thing the book argues is that, what I call the economic elite, when they become part of the political bargain, or they have a seat at the political bargaining table, they will push for things that are in their own self-interest. It just so happens that the very first things they push for that are in their own self-interest are things like property rights, are things like massive investment in certain types of infrastructure that helps trade. And they're doing this not because they think the economy benefits from it. They don't, we should be thinking of them as self-interested. But what you want to get, if you want kind of the onset of modern economic growth, is for that group to have at least some seat at the bargaining table. And then, so what the book argues then is that because of this equilibrium that emerged in various parts of the Middle East at certain times, and a lot of my research focuses more so on the Ottoman Empire. It's what I'm a little more familiar with than other parts of both the region, and certainly the broader Islamic world. So the book barely touches on, say, South Asia or Southeast Asia, where obviously today a good portion of Muslims live. But in the book then compares this outcome to what was happening in Europe over time. And what was happening in Europe over time was that actually religious legitimacy, which very obviously was important. Now, this is not to say that religious legitimacy was not important. The church, I mean, if to the extent that you think of medieval politics in Europe, the church is at the center of this. But over time, what happens is as kind of commerce starts expanding, as you start to get trade reviving in, say, the 12th through and 13th centuries, the church starts to lose its power, in part because it's in a weaker position to begin with. And then with the onset of the Reformation in the early 16th century, those parts of Europe that adopt the Reformation, including importantly Northwestern Europe, so England, and the Dutch, the religious legitimacy more or less becomes, next to a very small part of the overall, political game. And instead, who gains power are parliaments. And parliaments represent the interests of, the economic elite. And, they mostly comprised of the economic elite. And very soon thereafter, you start to see massive, both political and then economic changes in these regions. I argue, it's no coincidence that soon after, the Dutch adopt the Reformation, that, you start to see economic growth there. It has nothing to do with the doctrine of Protestantism, though. It has to do with the politics that come along with kicking out the church, which is what the Reformation does. I mean, it actually, in many cases, appropriates the assets of the church as well. And then England eventually, it's also a Protestant state. Again, nothing to do with Protestantism. It has much more to do with the politics of what Protestantism and kind of a move away from Catholic legitimacy by the Catholic Church entails. And the book, going back then to the Middle East, and especially in this period where the Reformation is going on, of course, the Ottoman Empire is the dominant player across the Middle East. This is a period where the religious establishment is being brought into the state. It's becoming, in almost every way, the religious establishment is actually becoming more powerful and more of a political player than it actually had been in many places. And the Grand Mufti is one of the most powerful people in the entire state. And this is something where, because of this, you start to look at, there's all of these, what you might think of as unanticipated consequences of this. And a lot of these, so I mentioned Timur Kuran before, are the types of things he draws out in his work, namely that there are certain aspects of Islamic law that, for no kind of what we might think of as an intentional reason by any means, so limit the size of partnerships, inheritance law has kind of dampening factors on various outcomes. And these are all things that, again, because of the power of religious authorities, this remains the law of the land, even though after a time it becomes clear that, especially by the 19th century, maybe, and to some keener observers a little bit before that, on many dimensions, the Islamic world's falling behind. So economically, so that's, I think, is as short as possible, a summary of the main arguments in the book. It's mainly a historical book, though. It's mainly a book of economic history.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. I think in order to set the debate, that was important for us to have the brief understanding of the book, because I'm not sure whether most of the audience have had the chance to read. I have enjoyed reading the book. As I mentioned, it is in my reading list as well. But if we start a debate, it's an exciting, because unfortunately in our circles, somehow such books are considered as doctrinal, and therefore they problematize it. But as you have highlighted, and as it is explained in the book, it doesn't go into the doctrinal aspect, but mainly looks at the institutional aspect, the political economy. And unfortunately, the political economy as a debate, as a framework, is not very popular in the Muslim world, because the politics with the political economy, they get disturbed somehow. And unfortunately, missing political economy in the classes in the Muslim world is a huge luck to be able to relate to such debate. But looking at your argument, and starting point of your argument is very much the modernism and modernist economic development or modern economic development. And therefore, it's very much based on the idea of the convergence, because modernity as a project considered that the world will converge towards the modernist objective. But do you think is such an assumption, considering in particular the times that we are now, with all this decolonizing knowledge and the post-colonial discourse and etc. I'm not talking post-colonialism impact in the Muslim world, but as a discourse. Looking through that perspective, do you think it is still meaningful to look at the rest of the world, including the Muslim world, through that modernist understanding and expecting a convergence, theoretically at least?
That's a great question. So I think the answer to this kind of would kind of extend the logic of my book, because I don't really discuss this formally, but I think that my book
that's the underlying assumption, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes. No, I think it's a great question. So my thoughts on this are that, so I mean, if you don't mind me indulging, I'm gonna take one step back.
Please.
And say that I think that, so early in my book, I say that if we want to think about, the subtitle of my book, Why the West Got Rich and the Middle East Did Not, colonization is probably not a great answer for that if you're talking about the initial inclination, because a lot of this, a lot of the institutional change was in motion well before Europe colonized not just the rest of the world, but certainly the Middle East. That said, what colonization did, and especially after Europe colonized parts of the Middle East, drew boundaries, things like that, is it then it changed the political economy of, say, the 20th century for sure, Middle East, the post colonial Middle East, in such a way that we can start to really draw some lessons in thinking about, again, when we just think about how rulers rule, what can they do? Well, what ended up happening in large parts of the Middle East in the 20th century is it was, not necessarily so much religion as it was the coercive power that was used by dictators that were propped up by the West in many respects. And in the background, though, another thing that I've been arguing elsewhere is that you do have this kind of lure of religious legitimacy as well. I think we're kind of seeing a reemergence of that in some places. Turkey being certainly one of those places. That this combination still, though, is and this is very much a direct result of colonization, is one that, if you think about the types of things I draw in the book, and has been drawn out elsewhere by other scholars as well, limits on executive power, having certain groups have some say at the political bargaining table. This is still something that in certain parts of the region, at least, is not really happening. And it's for a different reason, though, right? I mean, than the one I draw it in the book, because the one I draw in the book really is trying to explain the origins of modernity. What I think when you're talking about convergence, on the other hand,
yes,
convergence is only really going to happen when you have, and to be clear, there's not one set of preconditions that you need. There's no one path to growth, and that's something that I did try to at least note in the book, that that England set one type of path, the Dutch set one type of path, and they were similar, but there are many different ways that modern economic growth can happen. What you do want to see is when you go around and look at other plaplaces that have really begun to grow. I mean, because so for instance, some Eastern Asian economies, very different, not just Japan, but the East Asian tigers that grew in the latter half of the 20th century now are very much at the top of the world income distribution, grew in different ways. One thing that was one thing that has been fairly similar among many of these countries, even though not all, because is constraint on rule, and where that comes from. And one thing that I think is somewhat of a unique challenge in many parts of the Muslim world is, at least even if religious authorities have lost power in certain parts, is there is always a lure that's there. And again, this is what again, I mean, I think that Turkey, when we're seeing this now, it's an interesting example of what's been happening under Erdogan, that was, if anything, pressed way down, after Ataturk, and this was something that that Turks of a certain age are they grew up in a very secular republic, but that Ottoman I think was always there, and this is something that it presents somewhat of a unique challenge. It's by no means an insurmountable challenge.
No, I appreciate that, but my concern surely is not necessarily the colonial process itself, as you mentioned in your book, that the impact of that is perhaps 18th, 19th century in the Middle East and the Middle Eastern Muslim world, but rather the theoretical assumption that is the base of your book, that we consider that one way or another, the rest of the world has to come towards that particular benchmark, the growth, whether the Dutch example, the British example, yes, there are differences in the growth, but the main objective is a particular linear growth or development. And that is very much the underlying assumption in the book. But my concern is that in particular nowadays, we are discussing not the colonization process, but the thought process in terms of how we look at the rest of the world. Do you think that there is a tension there in terms of the theoretical approach to the subject matter? Perhaps some part of the world doesn't want to develop in that sense of modernity, or because the particular social formation is different?
Oh, I 100% think that that's probably the case. Yeah, and maybe I should make clear too that I think what I'm trying to do in the book is just try to more explain what happened, rather than try to explain or try to say whether a society thinks that's good or there's obviously downsides to growth too. Climate change is a big one.
Yes, in particular, yeah.
That is a direct result of economic development. So this is the book is not directly saying that economic development should be the end all be all goal. I mean, my own personal ideas. Yeah, I do think that economic development where it's happened has brought now we can say billions of people out of the lowest of poverty, which had been the state of most people throughout history, right? I mean, until the 19th century, 98% of the world's population was living relatively close to subsistence. I'm sure all of our ancestors not that long ago were relatively close to subsistence. So I think that on the one hand, moving people away from that is the laudable goal. And it's actually, I mean, one of the reasons I got interested in economics in the first place was thinking about that. Now, whether we need to raise per capita GDP from $50,000 to $75,000 or something like that's a very different question. And I don't necessarily, and I think that that's a debate that people with good intentions can have very different takes on. I think in a sense, though, the book doesn't hit on that. The book is not about whether that's a laudable goal or not. I do think that one thing the book can hit on, though, is something that you also touched on, is that the extent to which societies are going to kind of go in this direction or not, there are cultural attributes too, right? Whether this is viewed as a laudable goal, I think first and foremost is a cultural thing. Now, certainly when we're talking about maybe moving from very, very poor, having high levels of absolute poverty, say something like people living on less than $2 or $3 a day, that's a little different in terms of, I think, that's not purely a cultural thing at that point. I think that's a human.
Of course.
But yes, and I think, if you kind of extend the type of stuff that I'm doing and kind of bring it into other literatures that look at cultural evolution or think about how these things evolve over time, this is something where you can get various maybe for lack of a better term, equilibria emerging in different parts of the world, where different goals are kind of emerge along with institutional formation as well. Because so I mean, I think that in a sense the book's silent on this, but it's silent on this for a reason. It's not that Yeah.
Yes, therefore, I just wanted to bring that forward because, yes, that's an underlying assumption there, but it has not been explored, of course, because your objective is different, but there's this underlying assumption. But in relation to that, therefore, which you explained in detail in the book, the shift that happened in the West, in particular in the British and the Dutch example of Protestant culture, is very much the change in the worldview, the social formation of the society, because you started redefining things. What is human? What's the human objective? What is the economic objective? So entire paradigmatic shift in comparison to Catholicism, perhaps. The Protestantism has done that, the Enlightenment process and etc., brought a new definition of everything. And within that definition, of course, parting from the old definition, because in the old definitions, as you highlighted, one way or another, societies were close. There were distinctions, but very much close. But now, in this new definition, in certain part of the West, as you highlighted, now it has become possible, such as when you define individual faculty being the hegemonic rather than the revealed knowledge. So you have moved into unconstrained domain. And that unconstrained domain gives you the right to, as you have discussed as well, to maximize. However, as you suggested, at the end of the maximization, of course, there's the social good as well. But that has given. On the other hand, other societies, including the Catholic as well as the Islamic, did not go through that process of redefining things. So I understand that your concern is not necessarily the doctrine, but at the same time, the consequences that produce in the West is very much, or in the Protestant world, is very much related to redefinition of that doctrine. And how do you see that debate?
No, I mean, I think that everything you say is very right, and it's consistent with the way I'm thinking. And I think that the points you're making here are really important for what, also something you said before, namely, when we think about convergence, what that even means.
Yes.
Because one thing I hit on in the very last chapter that I just briefly touch on, because it was something that if I were to go deep into it, I would have probably had to double the size of the book.
Yes.
Is to think about what it means to say, all right, on the one hand, you have the growth of this modern economy, whatever you want to call it, in England, yes, and the Dutch area. Mm-hmm. How does that, how does that get exported to other parts of the world? In some places with maybe either similar institutional cultural attributes, the transition was somewhat smooth. So parts of Germany, for instance, in the 19th century, yes, are able to kind of adopt this, and Germany becomes rich. Where you have very different kind of cultural attributes in this, it's very, very exact types of things you're talking about, whether it could be Enlightenment ideals, or it could just be just the way of viewing the world. And in fact, I think that's the appropriate way to even kind of think about what culture is. It's kind of it's a framework, yes, for viewing the world. Yeah, exactly. The world's very complicated. How do I interpret what I see? What are the types of shortcuts that I use? That these are things that are culturally determined. They're at the society level. Oftentimes, we'll see similarities. Well, where you have sufficiently different kind of cultural views on a variety of things. It could be how politics is done. It could be what is the role, how a whole host of economic things, like how we even buy things, what are markets, things like this. Well, when that is very different, you can't just full on import the types of economic institutions from England or something. You can't just import finance, right? If the mindset of the culture of a place, and this is not just in Islam, as you mentioned, and I think one thing that I really tried to draw in the book is that even within Europe, there's divergence, and as you're pointing out here, you see the divergence in a place like Spain, which was much like the Ottoman Empire. One of the leading economies in Western Eurasia in say 1500, fell behind pretty rapidly starting in the 17th century. And I think you can call it, you can look at very similar outcomes happening there as well. Certainly Southern Italy would be another area, actually Northern Italy to some extent. And I think that, when we think about, all right, well, how how do we say, if we, you know, to your other point, do we even want to export this
Yes.
this type of finance, this type of trade, or this type of capital accumulation, or
Yes.
industrial production? In some cases, the answer might be yes. In some cases, the answer might be no. I mean, and this is just going to depend on culture, you know, which is going to change over time as well. And yeah, so no, I think that this is of first order importance for thinking about convergence. In fact, I think that it's been one of the leading shortcomings of thinking about how to make, you know, and actually in development economics, is how do we make other you know, poorer countries rich, is not considering the cultural side. You can't just take what works in one place and think it's going to necessarily work in another place. Maybe it will, if you know, if cultural elements aren't too important for whatever you're talking about to work. But when you're talking about large scale institutions, that's almost never going to be the case.
Yes. I mean, the development economics in itself is very much value based and very much ideological positioning of convergence is very much based on convergence. I mean, this is an important debate, but I know colleagues are there as what they want to ask. But going to the, hopefully we can come back to that, or hopefully in another opportunity we can discuss this ontological part, because I feel it's an essential. We have not been able to tackle how do we define on the different definitions. And in the Enlightenment period, you end up with entirely new definitions and suddenly take off. And however, the other parts of the world, they don't want to define. Or as we have today with the sustainability discourse around us, development economics have told us that in order to consider a country developed, we need to look at, for instance, electricity consumption. The higher, the better. But nowadays we are saying that no, the lesser is the better. So looking at those dynamics, but beyond that ontological issue, coming back to one of the important issues, because time is an issue, is the institutional part that you are dealing, and that's the main argument of the book. But and those graphs, by the way, I really loved in the figure 1 and the figure 2, where you go on the established framework, how it is working, the rulers' bargaining power, legitimacy. But in the case of Islam and the Muslim world, aren't we assuming too much on the independence of the scholars, Islamic scholarship, in terms of affecting the process? Because that is what I felt, because the institution of scholarship, unlike the Christian tradition that you had in the West, that wasn't as such a formal scholarship institution. It was very much civil society oriented, and therefore it played an important role negotiating between the civil society and the rulers. But later they were entirely incorporated. In other words, rather than providing legitimacy through bargaining, it was the coercive legitimacy process. In other words, scholars had to give the fatwa to legitimize it. And therefore, perhaps scholars did not have, the scholarship did not have that independence in the later part to be able to affect the process, to be in the bargaining table. But I think in the book that comes forward as an important assumption, as if they had that. What would be your response on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, you know, this is something that I think you're right, that it comes very clear in the Ottoman period, in particular, that in the 16th century, the religious establishment brought into the state, you know, at least and this is something that, you know, I do note that you kind of, when you're thinking about it, there are kind of two things going on. One that's good for the ruler, if, you know, from the Sultan's self-interest, and the other not, namely that when you bring the religious establishment in the state, you're doing exactly what you're suggesting, is you're decreasing their independence.
Yes.
And independence is really important for, you know, thinking about the capacity of religious authorities to legitimate the state. I mean, if the religious authority is just viewed as a puppet of the state, that they can never say anything negative against the state, then who cares in a sense what
Yes.
they're not really kind of saying updating what I think about the state. I know that they're just a mouthpiece. On the other hand, you say, all right, well, if the religious establishment is part of the state, at the very minimum, I know that if I want to do something controversial, like maybe declare war on other Muslims or something, then they will find a way to legitimate that. I will get the fatwa I need. So yes, no, you are right that the power, I think, decreased of religious authorities because they were brought into the state. That said, I mean, I don't think that this means, and if you look at kind of the writings of some of the leading religious authorities at the time, I don't think that their power was by any means diminished anything close to zero in terms of their power to have moral authority. And I think in part this was because a lot of what those religious authorities that were part of the state were doing, where they were just kind of functionaries of the state. They were doing regular judicial rulings, most of which the rulers the sultans wouldn't have cared about. They were dealing with base disputes between people. Yes. And because of this, they actually had a lot of local legitimacy as well. Not just those based in, say, Istanbul, but throughout the empire, because they were the ones that were on the ground actually providing some measure of law and order, providing some measure of state capacity in these areas. And if anything, people, especially outside of, say, the capital, would have been much more familiar with their local religious elite than they would have been any type of political elite, and frankly probably would have viewed that religious elite as this, in many ways, also the state. So there was this kind of convergence that happened within, especially the Ottoman Empire, because I think to an even greater degree than in Middle Eastern history, they were really brought into the state, that you see this convergence between the roles of the different hats that the religious authorities wore. I mean, they still at the end carried this aura of religious legitimacy, I think, without a doubt. But
indeed, I mean, we have that religious legitimacy, but the religious legitimacy affecting the process in the nature of that we expect, for instance, expansion of the society, expansion of knowledge, expansion business environment, and etc. To be able to represent. I mean, if you go back as early as 8th century, for instance, one of the greatest imams of the Islamic history, Imam Azam Abu Hanifa. He did not provide legitimacy, for instance. Therefore, he suffered, and that's an important position. Therefore, whatever the legitimacy was produced later, it was very much manufactured legitimacy, and therefore, perhaps even despite the fact that I criticize a lot the Islamic scholarship myself, but on the other hand, recognizing that somehow they did not have the independent nature of the bargaining to go into the process, but coercively they provided legitimization, at least in the eyes of the rulers, or in Istanbul or in Baghdad and Cairo.
Let's start Q&A soon, Dr. Mehmet.
Yes, let's move. Yeah, after this one, yes.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's broadly right. I mean, I think though the one thing that I would say that I think was a really important outcome of all of this is the type of stuff, say Quran points to, that namely, one of the outcomes is that Islamic law remained the law of finance and of commerce more generally. And there were unanticipated consequences of that. Whereas, in Europe, in really before the end of the medieval period, even canon law, religious law was kind of replaced by secular or merchant law, and was much more because merchants were actually in on this, much more responsive to their interests. And I think that's the outcome that is among the most important of these. When we think about, so maybe on most types of policies, religious authorities would have had very little influence, but I do think that we see that the persistence of Islamic law as it relates to commerce as a really important outcome in this process. And that's, I mean, I think that's where, I would maybe push back just a little bit, but I think you're broadly right.
Okay. I mean, I really love to continue with this, but we have to take some questions from our audience as well. No, that's important. I mean, one of the other things I want to discuss the whole definition of capital accumulation and the movement of capital, of course, the prohibition of interest. But let's go to our guest, and then if there is time, I can go back on those issues.
Well, we've got a lot of questions on the hand. So if I just take the first one from Dr. Huria from Indonesia. Dr. Huria, just unmuted you.
Yes, thank you very much, respected Professor Jared Rubin and Professor Mehmet Asutay. Huria Al-Islami from the hedge fund management agency. Well, I have not had access to the book, but we do hear the discussion on colonization, culture, and segregation of commerce and religion, etc. But Professor Jared, you also said the book basically describes historical facts. Noting that you have done substantial research to write the book, I would like to hear your professional and personal view, not merely description of facts. Say, if you will put in 3 or 5 words, what would you say the real reasons why the West got rich and the Middle East did not? Thank you.
Wow, 3 to 5 words. I would okay, so if in one statement it would be to some okay, I mean, maybe
yes, go on.
I think getting religion out of politics really was important. And it's not just that, it's who replaced religious authorities in those parts of the world. And then when we talk about the extension of wealth, yeah, colonization played a big role. And I think that it played a big role in the divergence that happened after the period of colonization, particularly in the 19th century. But yeah, I mean, it's a question that I could write a book on.
Okay, let's hope for that.
Mustafa Yachi, please. Yaji.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, for the rich discussion. My question will be about the influence of economic ideas on economic development. There is literature on the influence of economic ideas in current political economy literature, but when we consider Ottoman Empire, there was a research a stream led by Professor Mehmet Genç, by the way, who passed away a few days ago, who argued that Ottoman economy, traditional Ottoman economic system, was guided by 3 principles: fiscalism, provisionalism, and traditionalism. So his argument would, translate that Ottoman elite did not want capitalism to grow in Ottoman Empire because they believed in a more egalitarian system, and their economic ideas were influenced by these 3 principles in addition to religious influence. So how would you elaborate on the influence of economic ideas on different economic development trajectories? And do you think a requirement for a more egalitarian system result in a different, traditional economic system in Ottoman Empire? Thank you very much.
That's a good question. I mean, I think that hits on some of the stuff we're talking about before too. When we think about, when I think about kind of culture, I think it's precisely the type of stuff the question asked about is, when we think about the worldview of in this case, particularly elites, because elites are the ones that are going to be, whether they be political or economic or religious or whatever, are going to be kind of forming this. And I agree that, that a traditionalist would, and the way I would think about that is, it's largely is kind of maybe backwards looking in terms of time, thinking about, the past as a something we want to replicate, as being really important, particularly in the 17th and 18th century in the Ottoman Empire. There's a whole literature on viewing, the reign of, say, Suleiman as the thing that we want to achieve again. And I do think that when that is that type of thinking is prevalent among the elites, institutional change is going to be fairly difficult, at least institutional change in a way that moves towards what we would think of as, say, growth, European style economic growth, for sure. I mean, I think that all of these things, though, are part of, what I would say is kind of one system where institutions and culture kind of oftentimes reinforce each other. So where you have, say, these type of cultural attributes, for maybe lack of a better term, or, ideologies, these are going to oftentimes be reinforced by the institutions, meaning that in the institutions, all I mean by that are those structures in an economy or in a society that provide the incentives to take on various actions. These are often going to be aligned with cultural attributes. So yeah, I mean, I think that because of that, we would also say that Western style institutions, whether they be, financial institutions or political institutions, can't just be adopted wholesale. And this is kind of what we were talking about before, because precisely of what, the question brought up, is that the worldviews of, particularly the elites were different. And in such a way that would not have necessarily been consistent with the type of institutions that had been emerging in Europe in the kind of the early modern period. It's a great question.
Just sent to you a question on chat, Professor Mehmet, from Namira Samir.
From?
Namira Samir.
Oh, Namira. Okay, Namira, are you there? Do you want to ask the question? Namira? Namira is one of our former students.
Okay, let me just...
She's perhaps, okay, we can just read, yeah.
Yeah.
Namira is currently doing PhD in development and gender issues. She says that Daron Acemoğlu and James Robinson also explored the institutional analysis of development by dichotomizing institutions into extractive and inclusive forms. But they left out the factoring of religious authorities in their theoretization of institutions, even in their investigation of why the Ottoman Empire failed to bring about development. My questions. One, what is the significance of considering what happens during the Ottoman Empire as the result of unsupportive religious authorities instead of extractive institutions, as what Acemoğlu and Robinson deduced? Two, does the same conclusion you drew in your book concerning the religious dimension and the institutional analysis of development apply to other Muslim majority countries?
Two great questions. So we'll start with the first question, Durham Jim's framework, where I think there are certainly similarities in the way they're viewing it and the way I view it. They largely, both in their, in their two most recent books, largely ignore the role of culture, or as I would describe it, and certainly the role of religion, in perhaps facilitating what, how they describe it as extractive institutions versus inclusive institutions. They're largely, their premises about how does a society get inclusive institutions, those that treat people, across the spectrum broadly, fairly, that, where rulers can't just extract from the population. And I think that when we're talking about the role that religion plays, again, I think that it's not so much religious precepts itself, even though, for reasons we've been describing here, I think, religion and religious culture can matter for how institutions work. I do think it's, though, the way I've described it in my book is that if we think about the capacity for rulers to be extractive, well, if they're very legitimate, they don't have to bargain with these other players that might want things that that limit their power. And I think that this is kind of, and in some ways, I think that my framework helps supplement some of the shortcomings of their own argument. I think that their argument does actually provide a lot of insight into, the connection between institutions and certain types of economic development. But yeah, of course, like when you're looking at different parts of the world, there are just different types of institutions that lead to different forms of development. Now, it was a very good question. The second question I'm forgetting. What was okay,
let me go back. Okay, does the same conclusion you drew in your book concerning the religious dimension in the institutional analysis of development apply to other Muslim majority countries?
Right.
I guess that's because Namira is from Indonesia. So
I think it's one of these things that it it differs by place for sure. And I mean, especially when you're talking about both kind of South Asia and Southeast Asia, the equilibrium, as I'm describing it, I think is a little different in terms of the capacity of Islam to legitimate rule, and and I think a lot of this is also historically driven as well. Whereas so maybe to move away slightly from Indonesia, maybe more to a place like Pakistan or something, or that part of the world where you had various different types of rulers over time and various religions that would have taken very different ways of legitimating rule, then yeah, I mean this is something that has become that has changed actually a lot over time and changed very recently as well. The same would have been true of, say, a place like Bangladesh. Whereas, in Indonesia, you have, obviously a very, a different history in terms of the capacity of Islam to legitimate rule. I mean, so what I would say is, yes, 100%, the argument is going to be different, not just for different parts of the Muslim world outside of the Middle East, but even within the Middle East itself, there's immense variation in the capacity for Islam to legitimate rule. And you're talking about North Africa as well. So I think that the primary difference, and I think this is true within Europe, within Christianity as well, is historically determined. And so on that front, there's no general theory, I think, which can really tell you exactly why one part of the world might have a different capacity than another. I think it's just, purely a function of various events in the history. And that's where really history matters. And you really have to understand the history of the region. That said, I do think we can think about, more general ideas of, well, to the extent that religious legitimacy is important in a region, given its history, what does that mean for certain types of economic outcomes? That's where I think, the more general theory that, I put forth, I hope can shed some light on those outcomes. Yeah, it's a great question though. And I would say, it's just a very quick aside, part of the reason why the book does not focus as much on parts of the Muslim world outside of the Middle East is it's just, it's not, I have not done the historical deep dive into, say, Indonesia that I have in the Middle East, and I'm the type that I don't feel comfortable writing on it unless I've done an extremely deep dive into it, and I feel like I understand the history to a deep enough point where I can actually think about it, from above, from 1,000 feet above or something like that. So I certainly know a bit about Indonesian history, but it's not something that I feel totally comfortable answering in specific. But yeah, I mean, I do think that, what I said before should hold. History really matters.
Great, we've got loads of hands, so I'm going to quickly go through it. Dr. Khalil Rahman, I'm just going to unmute you.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to read the book, but what I was struck by your narrative there is emphasis around property rights. And I'm just wondering, to what degree do you think the issue of property rights played a major barrier in terms of, the title of your book, and trying to understand that context? So one linear angle could be the acquisition of wealth and property by the church in terms of early Christendom was fairly significant. You then have the dissolution of the monasteries, Henry VIII. So essentially what you then see is a downward trend of breaking apart the acquisition of property and wealth by religious authorities. You then have a curve which has temporal and spiritual power within the Islamic world centered around, the ruler. But then over a period of time, you start to see, as Timur Khan talks about, the idea of endowments, waqf. So you get significant buildup of property acquisition, all the way up to the 19th, sort of 20th century. So I'm just wondering, your view on to what extent has that played a significant role? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's one of the foremost out. So when I describe kind of political outcomes in my book and economic outcomes, I always kind of come back to property rights as one of the big ones, because it is one of the big things that as I described it, the economic elite end up bargaining for. And, you mentioned English history. I mean, I think English history is kind of it's certainly in this literature too. It's one of the linchpins that you look back to, over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries between the Tudors and the Stuarts in England. A lot of this kind of back and forth between Parliament and the Crown is about property rights. There's a large literature that discusses this. And there's part of this literature that it's somewhat debated, and actually including by myself, but I think the broadly construed is correct. After 1688, Glorious Revolution, you start to have a movement towards much more secure property in England. And I think on the flip side, Quran's work on the Waqfs is actually a great example. This was so. Also as an aside, I work with Timur Quran, and I was actually many years ago. He was on my dissertation committee, obviously I'm highly sympathetic to his work. And I think the example of Waqfs is a great example of why having secure property rights is so important, because his argument, which I think is correct, is that if in the absence of real secure property rights, you look for alternatives to place wealth. And Waqfs, because they did have this aura of certainly religious aura to them, were seen as relatively secure places to place capital, especially over time, to place capital in a way that could also evade inheritance laws. You just have your son as the primary director of the Waqf and pay that son a handsome salary, and that's a way to give your son most of your inheritance. But the reason this could also be done is because, or it was done rather, according to Quran, and I think that this is his argument strong here, is that the property rights were really weak in terms of, especially for those that were wealthier. If you were wealthy enough to really endow a Waqf, for instance, you probably had enough property where you might have been worried about your own property. So that means that there are these kind of what you might think of as suboptimal ways of going about investing your property. Waqfs are very strict on what you can do. Once the founder has set out what the Waqf is going to do, it's very hard to change that. And that it's very hard to change it in such a way that capital accumulation, to the extent that you think that might be a laudable goal. I'm not saying that not saying one way or the other. I'm just kind of saying purely kind of from a pragmatic point of view, in terms of what we might think of as key to the growth of the modern economy. These were things that the Waqf was not going to be a vehicle for, according to Quran. And again, I agree with them. So I think that it's a long-winded way of saying the property rights were fairly essential to this process.
But sorry to interrupt there. I know there are questions, but again, doesn't that bring us the whole ontological meaning of what is property? In other words, until the Reformation period, the meaning of property was very much similar to what was in the Muslim world as well, the nature of ownership. So the property is defined in a particular way in Islam, and therefore whatever on earth belongs to Allah at the end of the day. So that provides a particular ontological meaning to ownership as well as the capital accumulation, that it is not something that should be considered as part of it, as part of the worldview, and therefore you have to pass it on. But on the other hand, with the Reformation, of course, the benchmark has become capital accumulation as well as the property rights. And therefore, even if we expected Sharia scholars to develop the necessary fiqh, a strong law in relation to property rights, the whole ontological reasoning, generating entirely a different social formation, perhaps that's something that we need to look into as well. So it is not only the legalistic approach, but the ontological meaning of what it is.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, and this is, I think, one of the, maybe even the key thing that, when to this discussion we've been having here, namely that when you say, all right, you want to, bring like some type of Western style institutions to the rest of the world, well, if even a conception of what property is fundamentally different and this is not just true, of course, in the Islamic world. I mean, when you're talking about
everywhere.
It's everywhere, so like in China, for instance, very different conceptions of what property is. And also even, what, at what level one can have property, is it part of the broader family's property? Is it, an individual's property? What is property?
Yes.
The entirety of the system that eventually emerges, and it's really, and it's actually even before the Reformation in Europe, but it's not that far before, it's kind of the beginnings of the fall of kind of feudal Europe, because feudal Europe was very kind of to the extent that there was a conception of property, it was the kings.
Of course.
This starts to break down. And because of that, you also then get, political institutions and political bargaining evolving along with it. So yeah, no, I mean, I think that this is a great point, and I think it's one of the real things that needs to be, man, I don't want to say overcome, because that means that, I'm putting some type of value on having development. I think that if we want to really say, well, what is development going to look like in a region, views on what property are probably first and foremost to understand what type of institutions might even begin to work, if that's your end. Yeah, it's a great point. I completely agree with.
Great comment, great question.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, can we get Dr. Jamil Mohammed? I'm just gonna unmute you now.
Hi, very interesting presentation. Love it. But basically, my sort of question is, or the comment I want to make, in liberalism, the most dominant aspect of liberalism we see is the capital. It's sort of the material benefit there. And we can see the consequence of this in the sense that we see the elite actually behind the scenes making the laws in their favor. So we see there's sort of a different viewpoint. The fundamental viewpoint within capitalism is totally different. It's about material benefit. But we saw what I understood from the presentation is that you saw within Islam, or some point within Islamic rule, that there was a disconnect between business and the rulers. So therefore, does this actually relate to the sort of the whole general viewpoint in life, that it's not actually just material benefit? Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that, broadly what the argument's just trying to make is that actually in the medieval period, in both Europe and the Middle East, you would have seen what I think of as what I'm calling the economic elite, but really I mean people engaged in like commerce. Not really like landowners, but people engaged in commerce don't have much political power. And the idea is that having them have zero political power often means bad things for the types of things that we eventually saw as economic development. This is not, though, to say that having those people have complete economic power, because you're absolutely right that, and this is what the book argues too, is that these people are not the commercial elite or whatever you want to call them, are not, when they come to power, they're not putting laws and policies forth that benefit the whole economy because they want to benefit the whole economy. They're doing so out of self-interest. Now, some of the types of stuff they bargain for happen to also really benefit economic development. A lot of the stuff they want doesn't, though. They want monopolies for themselves. They want trade rights that benefit themselves oftentimes at the expense of others. They might want restrictions on trade that benefit themselves. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a middle ground here that at least, the book points to in terms of, the type of development that we end up seeing. There's some middle ground, that to the extent that you have some political power for those groups, it tends to benefit economic development, but too much also ends up damaging it. I don't know if that completely answered your question, but that's kind of where brought it to in my mind. So,
final question from Dr. Habib Ahmed, and I'll hand it over to Professor Ahmed.
Yes,
Dr. Habib.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion and talk. I think what I get from at least the parts where which you discussed here, a lot of focus on property rights. I was more inclined towards the other very important, I think, determinant in terms of economic development, which may be more on the cultural side. It relates to the human capacity, the human aspect in terms of creativity, in terms of entrepreneurship. And the key here is the knowledge, the role of knowledge in economic development. And I think one of the key things which I've not read your book, but from the table of contents, I can see you have talked about this, the issue about the printing press.
Mm-hmm.
That Muslim world actually got the printing press actually 300 years after the West. And I personally feel that probably that was one of the key determinants of the differences in the development in the West and the Muslim world, especially the Ottoman Empire, which was in some ways ruling the Muslim world, because knowledge plays a very important role in development. So the question is, what do you think about the culture which the Muslim societies of civilization adopted, which in some ways limited the creation of knowledge, which could promote development? And the related part was whether the religious authority was in some ways constraining this or promoting this, this kind of culture.
It's great questions. Yes, and yeah, maybe I did kind of misrepresent some of what I was doing, because I do think property rights are really important. But yeah, no, I think that there's a whole host of outcomes that were really important. As you mentioned, the printing press is one. I spent a whole chapter on. I have a few papers on it as well, because I think it's one of these. I think just missed opportunities for a variety of ways. The Ottoman Empire did not have at least printing in the Arabic script for a few centuries after the spread of printing. And one thing the book tries to do is explain that within this context, namely and actually, to get precisely your question, this was something that would have been against the interest of the religious elite. And I note that that they were right to think this way. If you only have to look to Europe, the printing press really did help spread the Reformation, which was probably the biggest blow to the church, well over 1,000 years. So I do think, so on the one front, knowledge accumulation that could come from printing, and that ultimately does come from print, that comes from, a massive expansion of books. It actually takes a while for literacy to really pick up in Europe. It's actually not until about the 17th, or in actually most places, 18th century, that literacy gets much above, say, 15%. But that long run outcome would be unthinkable without the press. One thing that I point to, though, that I think is possibly even more important with something like the spread of printing and the knowledge accumulation that comes with it, is what that possibly does to institutional formation. Namely, now you have types of technologies that can spread information really fast. You think of something like the printing presses. It's the internet of the 15th and 16th century. That's the most important ICT information communication technology possibly ever. Probably the last 1,000 years. And what that does is it makes dissent much more feasible, because it can spread much more rapidly. You look to something like the Arab Spring. Think about the types of social media that were kind of key to some of that spreading, and I think you see something similar. And so what ends up happening in Europe is you do get major religious upheaval. In some places you get political upheaval as well. Not it's mainly from below, stuff like, say, the Peasants' Rebellion, things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think that to precisely your question, and I think you're right, and it's the way I was thinking about it too, is that this is that this was very much something that was in the religious scholars' interest to not have. And in fact, so there's other work that's been done by Eric Cheney, who's now at Oxford, who he looks at the production of religious works versus scientific works in the Islamic world, from essentially the spread of Islam through, I think it's about the 16th or 17th century. And he sees, not surprisingly, there's a huge increase in scientific works in the first few centuries of Islam, when you think of the Golden Age. And it's right around that 11th, 12th century when, you start getting the spread of the madrasas in particular, and, the real kind of consolidation of the religious establishment, that you see it go, convert, the exact opposite. Scientific works go down, religious works go up. So, when we think about the incentives of the religious establishment, they are to kind of continue this, because this is their source of power. I think that's right. And I think when you're talking about very long run economic and political outcomes, that's of first order importance, for sure.
But don't you think that in that relationship, again, going to your depiction of figure 1 and figure 2, and therefore perhaps the knowledge development is something that was not facilitated by ruler again, because when we see the decline, after a certain period, when the expansion of political power at the expense of religious authorities and incorporating the religious authorities and removing them, providing independent legitimacy, but coercive legitimacy. At the same time, that resulted into a huge decline in the scholarship. I mean, when I look at the diminishing nature of the number of scholarship, for instance, in the Ottoman period, 600 years, hardly anything out there. But what we see is, strangely enough, perhaps what you are referring to religious authorities is very much Islamic law, fiqh oriented, rather than thinking oriented, rather than knowledge expansion oriented. So, and therefore, again, the political authority and the relationship with knowledge, I think, plays an important role there, rather than the interest of the Islamic scholarship, perhaps.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that's kind of one of these key outcomes. And this is also something the book tries to explore too, is so there's this, kind of old westernized trope that, the gate of ijtihad was closed. There's been plenty of,
which you mentioned, yes.
Yeah. There's been plenty of scholarship that, suggests it really wasn't closed. But on the other hand, this type of stuff you're describing, I mean, I also think that this literature, even the kind of the revisionist literature, doesn't suggest that you have this kind of massive expansion of ijtihad, that you have this really vibrant Islamic law. A lot of it is kind of, it is more kind of backwards looking, trying to, it's taqlid. It's looking back and trying to, essentially stay within the previous interpretations. And one thing that I think is an outcome of the type of stuff I'm explaining is that this is very much part of the equilibrium. And I think it's a really important part of the equilibrium, because it means that that responding to these massive changes that are either coming from the outside and eventually do from, say, Western Europe, but even from the inside as well, it's not as incentivized, and those in power don't have an incentive to do it. When they don't have incentive to do it, it often doesn't happen.
They wanted to dominate the knowledge production process as well, and therefore we can see the huge shift towards fiqh only, the everyday life, dealing with everyday life, rather than producing knowledge which could question the legitimacy of the state, for instance. Okay, that's
great.
good.
I think we come to the end now. So, Dr. It's up to you now. If you like to sum up,
very shortly, just one. Something that you have fantastically summarized your book in the introduction, and everyone who cannot read the book, at least read the introduction. But a position, perhaps I thought, Polanyian great transformation. I was looking for, because that could perhaps explain the Middle East in the sense that we are discussing, an important framework, I thought. But then when I was going through, I noticed that is missing. Is that particular reason, or it is because you didn't think that it was very much relevant to Middle East?
It's a good question. No, I don't think, it's not an intentional slight by any means. I mean, I think that what I was more so trying to do, and this is just kind of more purely from kind of a stylistic point, was build off of much more recent institutional work that, in a sense, builds off Polanyi, for sure. I mean,
yes, and therefore I thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say that maybe in retrospect, I at least should have cited and maybe given a few sentences to. But I think a lot of the type of recent work that has been done, especially by people like Greif, to a lesser extent, North,
yes, which you summarized there.
Yeah, it builds off of everything they're doing, or Polanyi did for sure.
Yes,
but that was kind of in many ways my starting point, right? So no, that's no. If anything, you bring up something I probably should have at least mentioned.
Okay, thank you for your time. I know it's very early morning there. Perhaps you haven't had your family breakfast yet. It was pleasure to have you, and hopefully we can meet in normal times, whatever that normal is. But let's keep in touch. It was good to have you. Hope the audience enjoyed the discussion as well. I really enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Mehmet, for being an excellent host and discussant, and excellent questions and reflections and thoughts, Professor Gerard. I hope you go back thinking, I hope the platform's been a great engagement for you as well. We've got loads of questions and loads of questions still coming through the chats, loads of questions coming on the, and still people still joining in lastminute.com as well, as far as all around the world. I told them at 4 o'clock, not
time difficulty.
5 o'clock, 3 o'clock, not 4:30 coming up. We're well over time, but it just goes to show an open invitation for both of you to come back, and we want to host both of you to maybe a panel discussion where we're going forward, like a World Economic Forum sort of platform type sort of thing. Does religion really have? I mean, we've seen with the rise of the evangelicals in America. The evangelicals are a powerful bloc in shaping policies and economics. So religion does still play an important role, and whether it's in Indonesia or Pakistan or in Turkey, it's come back, and especially with Putin and the the church. So there is still an influence, and given their large, maybe in England, because of the church's role is still it's declining, but still the church still has a huge number of assets. It's one of the largest land owning folks after the Queen. So I think the discussion still needs to go on. We probably needs to work on it, maybe some. So invitation to both of you to maybe come back at a later time, maybe after maybe a couple of months' times. We don't know what the situation is. But anyway, Gerard, have a great holiday, because I know you're off for the next one week or so. Professor Mehmet will be in touch. And once again, folks, thank you so much. Leave your email address. We'll send you the link to the recording. Other than that, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Take care.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.